Chapter 15. Sarah Quazell shuddered as another brief spell of lucidity overcame him, and then realized that, for the first time since it had become trapped in this madness, the other intelligence that shared its physical space was also momentarily sane. "Who are you, Yog-Sothoth?" he demanded in over 1,000 methods of communication. "What are you doing here?" The answer came back as a series of mental images, tinged with confusion and anger. "I do not know, Sarah Quazell. After my last visit to this planet, I was flung into the void, where I waited, recovering from the damage inflicted on my being. And then a compulsion overcame me, dragging me back here in an unbreakable thrall. Since then, I have been barely conscious. A familiar tale. All I can recall, I have no interest in your personal history." Sarah Quazell was surprised by Yog-Sothoth's brusque dismissal. "If we pool our resources, I neither crave nor need your assistance to free myself. I still possess enough of my power and intellect to find my own way out. I simply warn you to beware the duplicity of the humans who infest this world." And then the intelligence lapsed into silence, but Sarah Quazell could detect it marshalling its considerable mental powers, drawing matter from the material form of the tabernacle and moulding it into new designs. Dark shadows began to materialize around the central chamber. Resigned to the fact that help would not be forthcoming from that particular quarter, Sarah Quazell decided that it was time to put its newfound sanity to good use. Reaching out, it tried to locate the psychic patterns that belonged to the human being who had helped create this situation in the first place, Ashley Chapel. It took but a few instants, but Sarah Quazell was puzzled by what he found. Patterns resembling those of Chapel were approaching the tabernacle even now, but there was a strength behind them that was both unexpected and strangely familiar. And then Sarah Quazell realized what he was sensing. Chapel, or whatever Chapel had become, was host to a portion of his own powers, a portion that he had either stolen or, more worrying, he had been given by Sarah Quazell during his madness. Deciding that further speculation was pointless, Sarah Quazell waited for Chapel to arrive. Besides, he was fascinated by the entities that the intelligence was creating. "They're free!" exclaimed the technomancer triumphantly, watching as Gargle and Elaine escorted the doctor and Luella from the tower. "Order your thaumaturgs to protect them from the Oryx, and then withdraw." The Hierophant nodded, barely able to contain her anger at Melifear's presumption and arrogance. But she decided that silence was the better course of action, given the urgency of their current situation, and did as she had been told. "You said that Bartholomew was among them," said the technomancer, pointing towards the little group that was wending its way towards them. "But—" And then she gasped. Gargill had obviously given her the same bad news that Elaine had given his mistress. Anastasia placed a comforting hand on Melifear's arm. "I grieve with you, Magistrix. Bartholomew's name will forever be venerated as a hero of the labyrinth of thaumaturgy." "A hero? A hero?" The technomancer span round, her face contorted in anger. "Barry never asked to be any part of all this. You wanted one last chance to prove yourself in battle, and look at the cost, eh? All because one bitter and twisted old spinster wanted to justify her empty and sterile life." She turned away and began crying with deep, uncontrollable sobs. Anastasia watched the display of emotions with conflicting reactions. The other woman's words had cut deep, but she was sure it was Melanie, not Melifear, who was saying them. Then again, that didn't detract from the truth that lay behind them. She had craved excitement. She had wanted to do something that would make Anne Travers proud of her, and all she had done was lead countless innocents to their deaths. And despite the fact that the conflict had only been partly responsible for Bartholomew's death, the guilt cut deeply. Part of her defended her actions. The thaumaturgs, cybrids and oryx that had laid down their lives were servants of the great kingdom, nothing more, and their very souls were forsworn to its service. But the doctor had convinced her that the very notion of the kingdom was nothing more than a fallacy. If she and the technomancer had other lives, lives that were free from servitude to the gods, then it stood to reason that every other living being that existed in the shadow of the wall of God's tears had such a life as well. Her need to prove herself had condemned those people to death, and even her abilities to reach beyond mortality and communicate with their shades couldn't give them that life back. You're right. This carnage was not worth the cost. She looked at the joint army as it retreated away from the Tower of Abraxas, the doctor and the others protected at its centre. And I shall carry the blood of those who have fallen to satisfy my folly to my grave, Melanie. Because the frightened girl in front of her was exactly that. The magics that had created the great kingdom had worn off, leaving a distraught young woman in the armour of the technomancer. Mel giggled. I still seem to have all her memories, she said, tapping her piled-up red hair, but not her disposition. And then her voice dropped as she indicated the unconscious Louise. What happened? How did Barry... She swallowed, temporarily overcome with emotion. The Archimage must be stopped at all costs, Mel. He has Cassie, and he's quite prepared to sacrifice her to achieve his unholy ends. Raising her hands to her mouth, Mel gave a horrified gasp. Cassie? And she'd be the first. Unless I can find a way to return this all to normal, he'll breach the Wall of Tears, and then the warped reality of the Great Kingdom will spill outwards, consuming the rest of Britain, and then... He shrugged. I can't say whether there'd ever be an end to it. And since this altered state is fundamentally unstable, the whole universe is in danger of dissolving into chaos, eons before its time. The whole universe, said Mel. The concept was mind-boggling and, to be honest, incomprehensible. London was one thing, the whole world was another, but at least the human mind could feel the scale of the threat. But the whole universe... Mel shuddered. The unravelling of the kingdom had definitely affected the structure of the tabernacle. Instead of the intricate but self-consistent geometry of the stained-glass palace, the angles were twisted and skewed to the point where it made the Archimage feel queasy if he stared at it for too long. He just hoped that he could find his way back to the domain of the gods. The child had stopped crying, and he checked to see whether it was still alive. Its pulse confirmed that it was. Excellent, he thought. The baby would be useless to him dead. And then a wave of dizziness overcame him, and he had to put the baby on the floor in case he dropped it. No, not an it, he corrected himself. A she. Cassandra Mason, daughter of Louise Mason, once an employee of Ashley Chapel Logistics. He was Ashley Chapel, he realized. Standing unsteadily, he looked down at the dull bronze armor that he was wearing with a mixture of uncertainty and disbelief. The last thing he remembered was being in his office with Chapel and that doctor fellow running the Millennium Codex. He stared at his current environment, the dusty beige soil, the walls of mist in the distance, the sapphire blue sky with its silent electric storms, the impossibly shaped palace of coloured glass, and felt his heart race. Was this the paradise promised by Sarah Quazell? If so, what was he planning to do with Mason's child? The memories evaporated as quickly as they had invaded his mind. Picking up the child, the Archimage braved the nauseating sight of the tabernacle and located the entrance. Nothing would stop his domination of the great kingdom and the universe beyond. I'm worried about Louise, said Mel. Louise was lying on a makeshift bed, actually one of the library tables, covered by a thin sheet of grey silk, but she hadn't moved or spoken since she had collapsed. The doctor, halfway up one of the bookcase ladders and halfway down the corridor, was reaching for yet another tome to add to the ever-increasing pile that was weighing down poor old Gargill. Hardly surprising, he called out. The shock of what happened in the tower, coupled with the dual personalities that plague nearly all of us, has almost certainly shaken up the synapses. She's healing naturally at the moment, or what passes for natural in this place, and I think we should just let her be. He jumped down from the ladder and extracted one of the books from Gargill's pile, threatening to unbalance the whole lot. Read this, and look for anything about the polarity of magic. He hurled the book down the corridor like a square discus, and Mel could only assume that it was Melifear's instincts that enabled her to catch it without thinking. Polarity of magic? It sounded like gibberish to her. Don't argue, Mel. You have a photographic memory and can read faster than a spielsnape being chased by a rabid dog, he snapped. We have very little time left, what with the Archimage's mad dreams of glory and the unravelling of reality. Somewhere in here, he threw out his arms to encompass the entire library, lies the answer to all our problems. So get reading. Mel sat down with a sigh, only to jump up again when her armour jabbed her in the back. Earlier she had asked the doctor whether she could take it off, but he had insisted that she continue wearing it for protection. Sitting down more gingerly this time, she opened the massive book and started to absorb its contents, occasionally glancing up to see what the doctor was up to. Thankfully, all traces of the Valeyard's costume were almost completely gone. That was something that Mel was especially grateful for. Although Mel didn't really understand who this Valeyard was, the Mellifier portion of her mind told her that he represented the ultimate pinnacle of evil. The thought of that, housed in and abusing the doctor's body, was almost more than she could bear. She shuddered and returned to her studies. She was halfway through the book, which did seem to concern polarity of magic after all, when a cry disturbed her. Looking up, she saw that Louise was thrashing around on the table. "Cassie!" she was screaming, her eyes darting around the library annex in sheer panic. Mel ran over and grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly and, she hoped, reassuringly. "It's all right, Louise. You're safe here." Louise seemed to calm down, but her eyes were empty and cold. "They've gone, haven't they? Barry and Cassie, they're gone." Mel swallowed. Her entire life had been spent bubbling along, looking for the best out of every person and situation that she encountered. But part of the trade-off for a life of eternal optimism was a complete lack of exposure to displays of deep emotions, and she realized that she was completely incapable of dealing with Louise's grief. They, she mumbled. "Cassie is still alive. You can be sure of that," stated the doctor flatly. Mel hadn't even heard him approach. If she weren't, this whole Sonnet Lumière performance would have come crumbling down around us. If the doctor's words were meant to be a comfort, they were a failure. Louise swung her legs off the table and stood in front of him. Then she slapped him round the face. "You bastard! You could have saved them! You could have saved both of them! But no, you were too frightened to use your powers. So thanks to your selfishness, Barry is dead and Cassie is in the hands of that maniac." She went to slap him again, but the doctor grasped her wrist. "T made a decision, Louise, the consequences of which you and I will have to live with for the rest of our lives. And believe me, that could be a very long time in my case. But Cassie is still alive. Help me to find some way to defeat the Archimage, and we might stand a chance of saving her life." Mel had never heard the doctor sound so full of guilt and self-recrimination, and her heart went out to him. Louise nodded, and then started to sob quietly. But it was clear that the doctor's words had sunk in. Mel leaned over to him and whispered, "How are you feeling?" He smiled wearily. "I've been better." Then he nodded at the book. "Find anything?" "There's a small section on polarity." "Excellent. Mark it up and give it to Elaine." He indicated the thaumaturg in the shadows, carrying a similar pile of books to Gargill. "It might help if I knew what was going on," she complained. This wasn't an uncommon occurrence, the doctor holding all the cards to his chest, but it still annoyed her. All right, he said, holding his hands up. "Very quickly, though. This great kingdom is based on 3 very different laws of physics, those indigenous to this universe, those of Sarah Quazel, who hails from the universe that follows this one, and those of Yog-Sothoth, the great intelligence, who is a survivor of the cosmos that existed before the Big Bang. Thanks to Chapel and Anne's meddlings in forces beyond their comprehension, all 3 sets of laws are fused into an unstable equilibrium. I've got to unbalance that equilibrium, but at the same time ensure that all the pieces fall back into the same place that they were to begin with." He huffed. "Satisfied?" "All the pieces?" She cocked her head at Louise. The doctor lowered his voice. "I'm afraid not. Although it is possible to use quantum mnemonics to manipulate individual strands of reality, that would demand a far greater knowledge of the subject than I possess. And if I tried, I might make matters incalculably worse." He laid a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Mel. Hut Barry, and all the other poor unfortunates who've perished during this sorry incident, are dead. And Cassie, well, she'll revert to her original physical form." Mel shook her head sadly. "That just isn't fair," she muttered. "The universe rarely is," he whispered. "That's why I'm here." He paused for a moment, an indecipherable look on his face, and then he smiled. "Now carry on reading. We've got a lot to do and very little time left." The archimage stopped at a crossroads and tried to get his bearings. It seemed like hours since he had entered the tabernacle, but there was still no sign of the central chamber of the gods. Whatever Saraquazel was doing, it had completely rearranged the internal architecture of the tabernacle. Hoping that a direct route to the chamber still existed, the archimage chose one of the routes on offer and set off down it. "Is this it, Doctor?" asked Mel wryly, looking at the huge pile of books that Elaine was placing on the table. "Are you sure that you've got enough there?" Then again, to her credit, she had read all of them from cover to cover, and each one was carefully bookmarked to indicate the sections covering the polarity of magic. The doctor nodded his thanks to Elan and sat at the table. "Thanks to your skillful use of the labyrinth's indexing database, yes, I think it is." "So what now?" "Hours of reading and research," she guessed. "We storm the tabernacle," he said curtly, "and confront the archimage." "Direct action. It's about time," she muttered. But there was one question that she really wanted an answer to. "I know this sounds, well, morbid, but why hasn't he killed Cassie yet? If he needs her life force to do the dirty, I mean." The doctor rubbed his eyes with his palms. "While I was not quite myself, I told the archimage how to stabilize this reality and then breach the wall of tears. But to start the ball rolling, he needs to sacrifice Cassie. The release of her life force will catalyze an Artron energy transfer into the archimage, which he can then use to achieve his ambitions." Mel suddenly saw what the doctor was getting at. "He's going to steal the power of those creatures in the tabernacle, isn't he?" The doctor nodded. "And siphon off the TARDIS's Artron energy while he's at it. But that still doesn't explain why he hasn't done it yet. The archimage could have initiated the transfer from within the Tower of Abraxas, but his conceit is such that he wants to do it in the presence of the gods, and the tabernacle is holding him back from the central chamber until we arrive," he said smugly. He picked up a single book from the top of the pile and started scribbling in the margin. "Or had you forgotten the identity of your goddess in absence? Anyway, go and gather Anastasia, Louise, Gargill, and Elaine, and then you can all meet me at the foot of the stairs to the surface in about 10 minutes. Mel reached the curtained doorway of the annex, but turned back. "And what are you doing?" The doctor smiled as he looked up from the book. "A little homework." Dawn was breaking over the whole of the great kingdom. Standing on the grey roof of the labyrinth, Louise decided that there was something refreshing about the cool wind that whipped through her blonde hair. She still felt sick to the stomach, and knew that most of the pain that she was due hadn't even hit her yet, but there was still a chance that they could save Cassie, and she owed it to Barry to do everything in her power to do just that. "Ready for the off?" announced the doctor cheerfully, his multicolored jacket flapping in the breeze. "But won't the tabernacle be defended?" asked Gargill. "The legends state that the will of the gods shrouds the palace, and that it is heresy to approach." "Trust me, Gargill," said the doctor. "The gods have got a lot on their minds at the moment. A few more interlopers won't exactly be at the top of their agenda." The Hierophant raised a finger. "Our best route is directly through the settlement." "No need, Anastasia," the doctor interrupted. "I have a far more direct route in mind." At her puzzled expression, he smiled. "I'll teleport us." "What?" snapped Louise. "It's perfectly possible, Louise, I assure you." Her voice was icy as she replied, "That's not what I meant. Doctor, what was all that crap about not being able to use your powers, eh?" She stabbed him in the chest with a finger. "You stood by and let Barry die, and let that bastard Chapel take Cassie because you didn't want to risk using your powers. But now, well, don't fancy the walk, so you'll teleport us there. You make me sick," she spat, walking away from him. "She's right," added Mel. "Why is it okay to use them now?" Mel, trust me, I know what I'm doing." He handed her a book. "In case anything should happen to me, I want you to follow the instructions I've scribbled in the margin." "You're up to something, aren't you?" He leant down and whispered in her ear. "I am, and it's extremely dangerous. But it's the only way to get close to the archimage and keep him occupied. Now," he held his hands in the air, "time to leave, everybody." "Will it hurt?" asked Mel. He shrugged. "Don't know. I've never teleported anyone before. Well, Not without technological support, at any rate. He frowned. Here goes. Next stop, the Tabernacle of the Gods. Louise blinked as the grey landscape of the Thaumaturg settlement sparkled and fragmented around her, breaking down into a featureless void. For endless, timeless moments, she was surrounded by total nothingness. And then the sparkling began again. This time a multicoloured kaleidoscope that rapidly resolved into, well, a multicoloured kaleidoscope. The Luella personality which still nestled inside her recognized the palace of stained glass as the tabernacle, the home of the gods. But to Louise it was a nightmare of odd angles and broken reflections, a bit like one of those three-dimensional illusions that had been popular about 5 years ago, except that the only result of closer inspection was the beginnings of a blinding headache. "Are you all right?" asked Mel. The doctor was leaning against one of the walls of the little room, clutching his head with his hands. Once again, he was wearing the long black robes of the Dark One. The strain was a little unexpected, that's all. He straightened up and sniffed the air, and then slammed the wall angrily. "Damn!" "What's wrong?" asked the Hierophant. "I've lost contact with the TARDIS again. I don't know where the central chamber and therefore chapel is anymore. Damn! I should have anticipated something like this." Both Mel and the Hierophant pointed towards the doorway opposite them. "That way," they said simultaneously. "Just ask a ruler of the great kingdom," added Mel. "Come on then," said the doctor impatiently. "There's no time to lose." A gurgling roar echoed around the room. "I thought you said that the tabernacle would be unguarded," growled Gargill. "That's because it should be," barked the doctor, struggling to make himself heard over another roar. "Unfortunately, it sounds like whatever it is stands between us and the gods." "Arland," ordered the Hierophant. "Defend us!" She turned to Mel. "What about Gargill?" Mel frowned, clearly unsure as to what to do. "Worry not, Magistrix," said the Cybrid, stepping forward to join Elaine. "My oath as your warlord compels me to protect you." The roaring drew closer, and Louise suddenly realized with a feeling of rising horror that it was coming from more than one source. "They're all around us," she shouted. "What are they?" yelled Mel, and then she screamed as the doorway in front of them was filled by a monstrous shape. 8 feet tall, its body was covered with matted red-brown fur. 2 circular eyes glared at them malevolently as it lurched towards them, its clawed hands reaching out. "A Yeti!" hissed the doctor. "I should have guessed,"